On Sunday, 7 candidates in Georgia's U.S. Senate race gathered for debate in Atlanta. The hour-long event was hosted by Georgia Public Television.
Good evening. I'm John Pruitt, news anchor for WSB-TV Action News in Atlanta, and I am your moderator for this evening's debate. The Atlanta Press Club has invited all 7 candidates who qualified to run for Senate in this debate. It's a nonpartisan race. The winner will complete the remaining 4 years of the late Senator Paul Coverdell's term. The candidates in alphabetical order are Ben Ballinger, a lawyer who lives in Somerville; Jeff Gates, an attorney and author who lives in Atlanta. Mr. Gates is a member of the Green Party. Paul McGregor, a businessman who lives in Alpharetta. He is a libertarian. Mac Mattingly, a Republican businessman and former U.S. Senator who lives in St. Simon's Island. Zell Miller, the former governor who was appointed to the Senate in August by Governor Barnes. Zell Miller, a Democrat, is from Young Harris. Winnie Walsh, a retired freelance writer who lives in Savannah. Miss Walsh is a Democrat. And Bob Wood, a real estate company owner and broker who lives in Duluth. Now, here is the format for this debate. Each candidate will be questioned by our panel of journalists. Answers will be limited to 1 minute, and should an answer call for a rebuttal by another candidate, then I will recognize that candidate for 30 seconds of rebuttal. Then the candidates will have an opportunity to question one another. In the second half of the debate, the candidates will again respond to questions from journalists. So, let's begin. It's time now for questions from the panel. We have 3 prominent Georgia journalists selected by the Atlanta Press Club to ask the questions. They are Tom Baxter, political editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution; Karen Greer, news anchor of WXIA-TV Atlanta; and Susan Hoffman, senior correspondent of Georgia Public Television. Thank you all for taking part in this debate this evening. And Tom Baxter, we'll begin the questions with you. Your question to Ben Ballinger.
Mr. Ballinger, one of the areas that Senator Coverdell focused on before his death was the war on drugs. And he came to believe that in addition to prevention efforts at home, it would also be necessary to support Colombia in its war against to support in some form Colombia in its war against guerrilla groups financed by the drug cartels. What is your view of the war on drugs, particularly with regard to U.S. involvement in Latin America?
I don't agree with giving Colombia $1.3 billion to pay them basically not to manufacture and sell drugs to us. I oppose that. As far as the war on drugs, I see a lot of casualties in my line of work. I'm a lawyer. I think the whole attitude about drug prosecutions is somewhat distorted, and that we should take a new, fresh look at it.
Karen Greer, your question now for Jeff Gates.
Mr. Gates, you are the author of Democracy at Risk, Rescuing Main Street from Wall Street, president of Shared Capitalism, a specialist in ownership engineering. Could you just kind of give us some idea of, it looks like privatization and restructuring are high on your list. Give us some idea of how you propose we get tough on crime and our criminals.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much. What you're finding is we have an enormous prison population now. We've gone from 335,000 people in jail to over 2 million in jail in the last 20 years. We're now criminalizing huge portions of our population. A lot of it be due to the war on drugs. We've gone from 52,000 to over 400,000 people in jail for drug offenses, a lot of nonviolent drug offenses. I think a lot of it has to do with us not having an economics that really works toward genuine inclusion. You'll find, for example, and this will come as a surprise to your viewers, I think, that the top 1% of the population now has financial assets greater than the bottom 95%. You'll find that over the last 24 months, the wealth of the 400 richest Americans has gone up $940 million each. Although it sounds like it was a great economic boom in the Wall Street, the truth is 86% of that went to 10% of the population, 42% to 1% of the population. So if you want to do away with crime, it seems to me a way to do that is to design your economics so it's more inclusive. And my book is about how to do that.
All right, thank you. Susan Hoffman, your question now for Paul McGregor.
Mr. McGregor, Hollywood is getting pressure from Congress to, A, not market R-rated movies to 17 and younger. They're also getting pressure as well to not allow them to screen R-rated movies. Some believe that the government should step in, much like it stepped in with tobacco, when the tobacco industry was addressing and advertising its product to teens. Should the government step in this situation? Yes. Why?
Yes,
No.
well, Susan, unfortunately, 60 seconds does not permit me the time to address this issue in the detail it really deserves. However, my website, paulmcgregor.com, presents our full platform of real solutions in both English and Spanish and addresses this very issue as well. Now, based on our polling, if I can discuss the election for a moment, the election November 7th is not about whom will be elected senator that day, but who will be in the runoff on November 28th with the governor's choice, Zell Miller. Now it's your choice. You can choose for the runoff
McGregor,
another career politician.
I must call on you to answer the question and not deliver a campaign speech, please.
If I may, our platform is fully disclosed on our website. We're one of the first candidates to have a website that discusses all these in great detail. So I want to alert the viewers to that fact, and they can check out my full platform of real solutions. Now, as a libertarian, we definitely believe in the ability for people to be able to freely express themselves, and we're a strong supporter of the First Amendment for all individuals in this society.
All right, thank you. Tom Baxter, your question now, this time for Mac Mattingly.
Senator Mattingly, among those who are here tonight, you're the only candidate who has served a full 6-year term in the United States Senate. We all learn from our successes and our failures. Looking back on your time in the office that you're running for again, could you name 1 or 2 things that worked that you'd want to do again? And can you also pick out something from your first term that you'd like to improve on this time around?
Well, I think primarily during my first term, I served on the Senate Appropriations Committee, and thereby was able to help Georgians across the board. Of course, I was chairman of the Military Construction Committee, which included saving and assisting in constructing the military bases and making certain our men and women in uniform had the proper places and sufficient and good quality. And also, when I was in the U.S. Senate, it was my experience, I think, of being able to become aware that I was able to save the peanut program in 1981, my first major victory by a vote of 51 to 47. When it was trying to be destroyed by those in Washington, D.C., we were able to make certain that we preserved it.
Could you, just to follow up for me, anything that you would improve upon? Any mistakes that you'd improve on?
Offhand, Tom, I can't think of anything I'd rather improve upon probably than the television advertising I did in my 1986 campaign, which obviously did not work.
All right, Senator, thank you. Karen Greer, your question now for Zell Miller.
Senator Miller, we've heard all the complaints before about fathers who are not paying child support, going after deadbeat dads. Your latest television commercial is addressing that point and mentioning, in fact, perhaps going after their credit cards. Could you tell us how you plan to make that work? What federal legislation would help back you up on that?
There was a recent article in the newspapers last week that said in the headlines that 200 million deadbeat dads still out there that are not making their payments. In Georgia, we set records as far as what we did with deadbeat dads. We made sure that they paid their payments and that they went directly to the family. We made sure that they also, if they lost their license, if they did not make the payments, they would lose their licenses, their driver's license, their hunting license. We would do the same sort of thing on the national scene, but we would also make sure that the credit card companies had their names so that if these deadbeat dads tried to get additional credit, that they could be cut off, because their first obligation ought not to be to a credit card company, but to their family.
All right, Susan Hoffman, your question for Winnie Walsh.
Ms. Walsh, in the wake of Columbine and numerous other incidences involving kids and guns, some are heatedly arguing that gun seekers can still buy guns at gun shows without background checks, and that currently manufacturers are eluding what should be imposed safety standards on the guns that they make. I'd like to know if this measure, which is currently being negotiated on Capitol Hill, is something that you would favor, a measure to close the loophole at the gun show and to impose safety standards on gun manufacturers.
I'm in favor of closing the loopholes at gun shows. In other words, I think that's where a lot of these guns, these rifles of destruction or weapons of destruction are sold. There's no way to check to see who, in essence, really owns the guns, because anybody can walk in off the street, as it were, and purchase these. I'm also in favor of locks that the government is, mentioning in Congress about putting locks on handguns as a safety factor for children because of the tragedies that had happened in Columbine. I think that's where I would go with the legislation in Congress. I would advocate stricter gun control and licensing guns at the gun shows, or closing that loophole altogether.
Thank you, Ms. Walsh. Tom Baxter, the final question in this round for Bob Wood.
Mr. Wood, you, I believe, are a former county school board chairman, so here's an education question. Congress and the president may be about to have a showdown over class sizes and federal involvement in education. President Clinton has threatened to veto an appropriations bill because it does not include his request to target money for smaller class sizes. If Clinton vetoed that bill, would you vote to override his veto, and why?
I would vote to override it because the number of students per teacher on a national level, with the national government being involved, would be diminished by such a small amount. I think it'd be a much better program to teach ethics in school, which is a bill that I passed while I was on the school board as chairman in Gwinnett County. Our society is going downhill so fast that we're going to have to do something in order to get people to lean closer to honoring the things that they should do relative to not what feels good, but what their obligations are. And we need to teach ethics in school because we don't have the ethics being taught now. Churches don't have quite as many people as they had before. Parents don't have as much time with their kids as they had before, unfortunately. So we're going to have to turn to the school and teach ethics. Otherwise, our whole society is going to go down the tube.
Mr. Wood, thank you very much. Now the candidates will have the chance to question each other. The candidates have 30 seconds to ask the question, 60 seconds to respond, and then 30 seconds for rebuttal. Ben Ballinger, your time to ask the first question to the candidate of your choice.
My question is for Senator Miller. All of the Senate candidates were invited by the League of Women Voters to state their position on many important issues and record those answers on dnet.com. Also, the Junior League of Women Voters gave a reception this past Thursday night in order for the candidates to meet with them and discuss the issues. I noticed that you don't have a response on DNet to the questions and that you didn't attend the reception, and I was wondering whether or not you had made a decision to write off the women's vote in Georgia and feel like you can win without it.
No, I don't believe I could win without the women's vote. And I'm certainly not writing it off, but I'm trying to do my job as a United States Senator, and that requires me to be some places sometimes where I had rather not be. I'm spending more time really in Washington, D.C. than I am in Washington, Georgia, or Washington County, and I wish the opposite were reversed. My record is pretty well known as far as government is concerned, and where I stand on most of the issues, and of course I'm very pleased to be part of this panel tonight. I look forward to being on other panels later in the week where we can discuss where I stand on issues thoroughly, but I'm sorry that I couldn't make those, but I'm not going to write off the women's vote. On the contrary, I'm going to always try to my best to make sure that they know I want their vote.
Any rebuttal, Mr. Ballinger? All right.
No rebuttal.
We'll move to Jeff Gates. Your turn to ask a question of the candidate of your choice.
Yeah, thank you. Paul McGregor, Libertarians and Greens agree that we are approaching a crisis in citizen apathy and distrust of the political process. In the last presidential election, only 42.6% of eligible voters in Georgia went to the polls. Only 11% of 18 and 19-year-olds, only 15% of those 18 to 25. Clearly, the two major parties will never voluntarily take actions to end their dual monopoly of political power. Yet without competition, we are seeing increasing corruption and decreasing accomplishments in Washington. what would you do to restore citizen interest and trust in our political process?
Well, Jeff, I agree. We have a real crisis of citizen apathy, distrust, and especially turnoff our young people in democratic processes. As you mentioned, only 16% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted in the last presidential election. The two controlling parties are bitterly partisan in their pursuit of political power, but amazingly very bipartisan in preventing the reform of campaign laws that give you, the voter, more choices and more power in elections. The cornerstone of my platform of Real Solutions is reforming campaign financing, allowing internet and weekend voting, and implementing term limits. Myself, I pledge to serve only one full term in the Senate. By the way, I'm also pledging to donate my full salary to the Lance Armstrong Foundation to demonstrate by example what we believe. And finally, on November 4th, I'm cycling from Athens to Atlanta to raise money for the Lance Armstrong Foundation to demonstrate our commitment to charities such as this that fight cancer. And in fact, I've asked my Senate counterparts to join me in that and to contribute to this great cause.
Any rebuttal, Mr. Gates?
No.
All right. So we'll move to the next question from Paul McGregor to the candidate of your choice.
Jeff Gates, the Green and Libertarian parties agree that the two major parties are of one persuasion and are leading this nation to an economic train wreck. In your latest book, Democracy at Risk, you point out how the financial assets of the real wealthiest 1% now exceeds the combined worth of the bottom 95%. Most frighteningly, you point out that 76 million baby boomers are barreling towards retirement with grossly insufficient assets to sustain themselves. Both major parties are ducking this issue. What would you do? They won't.
Yeah, keep in mind we have, again, 76 million baby boomers. I'm on the front end of that at age 54. Barreling toward retirement with votes and very precious few assets. I don't know where the real conservatives are, but the Greens are the real conservatives because we think we ought to have a broad-based property-owning democracy, which we don't currently have. You can't have assets equivalent to 1/8 of the GDP in the hands of 400 of our individuals in this country and have a robust democracy. We know that. We've learned that from history. But really, you know, the debate has been about Social Security, about how we're going to finance it so far. That's not the issue. What we should be asking 65 years later after we put it in place, why are so many Americans still dependent on it? Right now, the Social Security tax is the largest tax that most Americans pay. It's also the largest asset that most Americans have. How in the world did we get ourselves in this position? And that's what I write about. That's what I've been advocating. If you go to gatesforsenate.org, you'll see lots of questions and answers on these issues and how to move forward in a practical fashion. Thank you very much.
Any rebuttal, Mr. McGregor?
Yes, actually, I'd like to both agree and disagree with Jeff. I agree with there's a large problem, as we point out in the question, but I would like to take a look at the U.S. slowly transferring to a system like Chile had done. It's amazing a country in South America has made it within 15 years allow their citizens to retire with many times the assets of what we do in the United States. So we must make sure that we secure the system for our present seniors and those retiring soon. We must now take the opportunity to be able to change our system to allow younger people to retire with many times the assets they never would on our present system.
Thank you very much. Mac Mattingly, time for your question to the candidate of your choice.
My question is to Senator Miller. I think you probably expected this. Right. Let me say that, first off, I believe everybody knows that I'm a Republican, conservative, and Senator Miller is a Democrat. And I've traveled all over the state this year, especially in the last 2.5 months. And what I have found that I want to ask a very simple question to you, Senator. I know that in 1992 you stood up and nominated your good friend Bill Clinton to be President of the United States, and along with Hillary and Al Gore. I'm going to vote for George Bush on November the 7th. Are you going to vote for Al Gore?
I'm going to vote for Al Gore, and I'm going to vote for Al Gore because of what he did for Georgia, especially whenever I was governor. When I was governor and we needed help during the floods and the 9 disasters that struck Georgia during those 8 years, he was always there. Whenever I needed help, whenever we were working on welfare reform, he was there. And especially he was there whenever we were trying to put on the largest peacetime event in the history of the world, the Atlanta Olympics. He was there and he was helping us. And I'm going to vote for him. That does not mean I agree with all of his policies. Far from it. We think differently on a number of issues, and I'm sure that we'll get to some of those before the night's over.
Senator Mattingly, do you have any rebuttal to?
Just one in reference to he helped you on welfare reform. It wasn't Al Gore or Bill Clinton's idea of welfare reform. It's Republicans that proposed it 3 different times, and the President of the United States vetoed twice until he found out the American people were for it.
Well, what I was talking about was hipping welfare reform in this state. We were one of the leaders. We were one of the ones that showed the national folks how to do it. And we were needing to get waivers, and we were needing to get things like that in order to do it. And he was very helpful. And because of that, we reduced the welfare reform rules in Georgia by more than half.
Let's move to the next question now. And Zell Miller, your turn to question a candidate.
Obviously, Mac, we have some differences, some major differences. One being Social Security. You had your chance to protect Social Security. Instead, you voted to raise the retirement age. You voted to cut the benefits 5 times. When you had a chance to put Social Security in a lockbox, you refused to do that. Now, my question is this. Were those mistakes, or is that how you feel?
Well, the honest answer to this is that when I voted on Social Security, we opposed it like Russell Long did, a Democrat, because number one, it was raising the age of the Social Security recipients from 65 to 67. And number two, it was putting a tremendous tax on the young people of our country. But now the circumstances that we'll be dealing with the United States Senate are different. The way we're dealing with it now is we want to make certain that we retain the benefits for those that are on Social Security and those near retirement. The difference between us and the Democrats and the Gore and the Democrats from your side and Ted Kennedy are that we want to allow young people the opportunity to take part of their Social Security earnings and put them and personalize it for themselves, so we can make certain that we don't get trapped in a program for the young people, but we want to make certain that we take care of the older people.
Rebuttal, Senator Miller?
You don't save something by making it weaker. You save something by making it stronger. And the way to make Social Security stronger right now is to take 15% of the surplus each year for 10 years and put that where you can shore it up. Put it in a lockbox where the politicians can't get to it, like you had a chance to vote one time and didn't. And that's the way to save Social Security.
You're right, Senator, but the lockbox was proposed 6 times in the Democrat U.S. Senate, where you are with Ted Kennedy, and they blocked it 6 times in the U.S. Senate for the lockbox. It's a Republican idea, and you blocked it.
No, I didn't block it. Look, I'm not Ted Kennedy, Matt. Look,
you're close. You're close.
No, I'm not. I am not close at all, and you know it. You've been knowing me for 20 years. Now stop that stuff. Let's run a campaign based on the issues. The issue isn't Ted Kennedy.
Let's move to the next candidate, Wendy Walsh. You have a question to pose to another candidate.
Yes, my question has to do with the face of the Supreme Court. During this campaign, my question I'm going to address to Senator Miller. During this campaign, Vice President Gore had made mention that after the election, no matter who wins the presidential election, that the face of the Supreme Court is probably due to change. And Vice President Gore made a statement saying that he was going to make sure that any of the appointments that he made to the Supreme Court would be in favor of retaining Roe versus Wade. And I was wondering how you felt about that comment that he made about being, picking out justices that would only go his way, as it were, with, with Roe versus Wade.
Well, first you should know that I am pro-choice. Mm-hmm. I'm not pro-abortion. Mm-hmm. I support a woman's right to choose. I think it's the most intimate decision that a person can make, and it should be made between her and her family and her God and her doctor. Mm-hmm. There should be certain restrictions, however. I'm for parental consent. I'm for restrictions on partial birth abortion. I signed a law whenever I was governor here in this state that did that. Abortion should be safe, and they should be legal, and they should be rare. But we should not have a litmus test for Supreme Court justices. I would be very suspicious of any person that had a one agenda or a cause. I looked for fairness and intellect and who would interpret the Constitution who would interpret the law under the Constitution. That's what I'd look for, not a litmus test.
You're satisfied with that answer, Ms. Walsh?
Well, I was just wondering, well, does that mean that you would not be in favor of overturning Roe versus Wade?
I think I stated where I was, that I support a woman's right to choose. And I think it's a very, very important decision that that woman makes, and she should have the freedom to make that without governmental interference. But I would not have a litmus test for Supreme Court justices. That ought to be, I appointed a lot of judges whenever I was governor. And I always looked for intellect and temperament and fairness and how they were going to interpret the law as it was written in the Constitution. That's what I'd look for in a judge.
All right, let's move now to Bob Wood, who will ask a question of another candidate.
My question is to Senator Miller. Mr. Miller, I have taken my own money and personally carried my county commission to the Supreme Court because they raised taxes after having been told in 3 years consecutively that the taxes shouldn't be raised. I won 5-0, taking a chance against the power structure. As a candidate myself, I walked out of a meeting in our 1990 governor's race because the Chamber of Commerce sponsoring it would not let the public outside the door come in. Candidate Andy Young, who was present, said of this, "I wish I had the courage to do that." Mr. Miller, please give us an example of what you have done individually and courageously against the power structure, or in pulling their wagon, have you ever bucked their reins?
Oh, many times, but I want to talk about what you first mentioned because that's one of the most important issues, and that's cutting taxes. I was a tax-cutting governor, and I'll be a tax-cutting senator. I cut taxes in this state 3 different times, income taxes, took the sales tax, state sales tax off groceries, cut taxes about $1 billion. And what I did as governor, I'll do in the Senate. We first need to take care of Social Security. We need to pay down the debt because that's the best tax cut that we could give our children and our grandchildren. And I went on record some time ago saying that I think that we should also cut the marriage penalty tax and also the estate and death tax.
All right, thank you.
May I have a rebuttal?
Yes, you certainly may. Sorry.
Of course, I know the audience recognized that Mr. Miller totally dodged that question, didn't say anything about bucking the reins of the power structure. The power structure is giving him over $5 million this year in order to run this campaign, which very few of us have any money at all. And that's how elections are won. In fact, some of my friends are saying, if Zell doesn't come on TV tonight, we'll be able to afford to buy some pizza.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Wood. I want to remind our audience at home that this is a live debate sponsored by the Atlanta Press Club. It features all 7 candidates certified by Georgia Secretary of State Kathy Cox. They are seated in alphabetical order, the same order in which they will appear on the ballot November 7th. Now, for this last round of questions, the format does change a bit to give the panel of journalists more leeway. In this round, the panelist may pose a question to one or more candidates of his or her choice, and then follow-up questions will certainly be permitted. I may jump in with a question or two myself. But now the rules do remain the same. We should tell you that the answers are limited to 1 minute. A rebuttal, when appropriate, will be limited to 30 seconds. So let's continue with more questions now. And I believe Karen Greer has the first question for the candidate or candidates of your choice. Karen.
Okay, for Senator Miller, you mentioned that Al Gore helped you while you were governor. Can you tell us what you've done to help Al Gore win Georgia?
Well, I have been very busy with my own race. I am having to do 2 things. I'm having to serve in the United States Senate, and it is going on for much longer than anyone thought it was going to be going on. I've still got to go back up there again this next week, and I hope it's going to end there. So I've not been able to get around to even politic very much for myself, much less anyone else. I'm going to run my own race. He's perfectly capable of running his own race. I told you who I was going to vote for, and I told you why. But I do think that the state of Georgia benefited from him being vice president, and I am grateful.
Susan Hoffman.
Mine is going to be directed to Senator Mattingly. In your material, you say that you want to save Medicare. Yet you repeatedly voted to cut Medicare funding or failed to restore previous cuts. This again was why you were senator back in the 80s. Can you explain your votes, and would you change them now if you could go back?
Now what we must do, because we have this gigantic $4.6 trillion surplus, hopefully over the next 10 years, is to make certain that we do save Social Security and to take that surplus and use it to save Social Security and Medicare. But also at the same time on Medicare is make certain that we take and get prescription drug coverage for the people of the state of Georgia and the people across our country. Because at this time, we have this major problem in people with high drug costs. And the Gore Democrat Miller plan is one that doesn't go into effect to the fiscal year 2003, whereas the Republican plan goes into effect immediately upon passage. And, you know, Medicare is going to be secured and has to take part of this surplus in order to make it secure because it goes broke in 2013. And we will support that.
Do you regret the prior votes?
It was different circumstances at different times back then because we had huge government debt back then. And we were trying to make certain that we tried to restrain federal government spending even by freezes to try to control that at that time because we were in a tremendous Cold War. The Cold War is over. Now it's a different situation.
Senator Miller, did you have any rebuttal on that? Your name was mentioned.
I'd like to respond to that because that's not quite the title of a prescription drug benefit. He keeps wanting to run against Ted Kennedy, or he wants to run against Al Gore, he wants to run against Tom Daschle. Bill Clinton. If you want to run against a Clinton, you ought to go to New York. That's where a Clinton's running. Now, let's talk about prescription drugs. The program that MAC supports, if you make over $14,000, it would take you 4 years before you could get any kind of benefit from it. The Gore plan's a little better, but there's one out there that's better than both of them. It's a bipartisan plan in the Senate that I'm a co-sponsor of. It gets the prescription drug benefits quicker than the Mattingly plan, and it gets cheaper than the Gore plan. And that's the plan that I'm associated with.
Let me ask, I'm sorry, did you have something ahead?
I know what legislation is up there also, Senator, and the plan that you're talking about does not go into effect until 2003. And the people around this state that I've traveled to want immediate relief, and the only way they can get it is by a plan that goes into effect immediately.
You just said it was the Gore-Miller plan, so you don't know what it is. This is the plan that is a bipartisan plan. It's made up of Democrats and Republicans. Senator Graham of Florida is the lead sponsor, and it is what will probably be adopted. You know how things are. Neither one of those plans, regardless of which one of those men is elected, is going to really go into effect just as they're talking about it. It's going to have to be changed. It's going to have to be massaged. I think it will be the one that I'm co-sponsoring in the Senate. And certainly, we have to have a prescription drug benefit for all of our seniors under Medicare. Your plan is not even under Medicare.
Yes, it is. It gives you a choice of both Medicare and an option through different plans. So you do have a choice for the senior citizens, and they need a choice.
It would cause anyone that makes less than $14,000 a year to have to go down to the welfare office and fill out 12 sheets before they could get the benefit. If they make over $14,000 a year, Mac, they would have to wait 4 years to get any kind of relief.
I think you're
That's not so.
Example of a bipartisan pig pen that is now infecting Washington, D.C. This bipartisan pig pen, what they're not raising is the amount of how prescription drugs are paid. The Walton family has 2,428 pharmacies. So you're basically putting a tax on my 27-year-old son to buy prescription drugs for my 90-year-old mother, which I appreciate. But the Walton family already has $80 billion out there. Why don't you address the issue? Why are people still so dependent on Social Security? We put this thing in place 65 years ago. If you last year's median income from Social Security was $783 a month. That's $26.10 a day. You can't rent a RV spot out there at Stone Mountain where you're trying to turn into Dollyland for $27.10 a day. Now I'm telling you, this country is on the line at this point because this bipartisan pig pen that these guys are running up there. You better listen to the Greens because we're trying to get you included. These guys are going to cut you out.
Let's move to the next question now. Tom?
Mr. Gates, I was just about to ask you a question. I'll get back to you.
It's like Kermit the Frog.
Senator Miller, perhaps the most serious vote that you might have to make in the United States Senate is the decision whether to send American troops into war, as the Senate did when it voted its support for Operation Desert Storm. Just today, the United States notified Saddam Hussein about troop movements within the borders of Iraq and warned him about taking advantage of the present situation in the Middle East to move on any of his neighbors. The signals coming from the Middle East are too confusing to ask you how you might vote in a hypothetical situation. But what guidelines and principles would you be guided by if you had to decide whether to commit American troops to another war in the Middle East?
Where our national security is involved, or where Americans have been killed, let's just face it, 17 innocent American servicemen and women have been brutally murdered. We must find out who is responsible for this terrible crime, track them down to the ends of the earth if it takes it, and make sure that they pay a heavy price.
Anyone else have a comment on when U.S. forces should be committed to foreign involvements? Senator Mattingly.
I do. I think only when the U.S. national interest is involved or an ally of the United States, such as, the tragedy that's happening now in Israel. Israel is our ally, and it is a democracy that has been surrounded by enemies for years. Some of them have now moderated. My experience comes from being not only in the U.S. Senate, but also as Assistant Secretary General of NATO and being a United States ambassador. So I have the background in that area to be able to look at these things, I believe, in the way they should be looked at, and they should be looked at in the interest of the United States.
Are you implying U.S. troops should be sent to the Middle East?
I'm saying not unless, as Senator Miller made the comment, somebody's death with some of our troops or even civilians are endangered. But I think it has to be considered in the context of what's going on in Israel at this time.
Could you explain that a little further?
Yes, I think that Israel is our ally, just like the NATO. They were our allies. And when NATO was developed, it was to deter the Soviet Union from aggression on those countries. We have the same type of relationship with Israel.
Yes.
I think we need to stay away from nation building. After the First World War, we helped build a nation and had to fight that nation in the Second World War. We're not big enough, we're not strong enough, we don't have the economy that we can support the entire world, and I think our nation needs to just simply acknowledge that and then look out for the best interests of our country while helping others but not nation building.
Yes, sir.
If I could address that. I think we've seen in the past 10 years in Washington, D.C. that we've not supported our military enough. We haven't provided them the resources and tools. We haven't allowed them to advance the Strategic Defense Initiative to defend citizens here in the United States. At the same time, we place them in situations where they shouldn't be, where, as you mentioned, they're in nation-building type activities instead of really defending the United States and our interests and our allies. So I agree with Mac that we need to be taking a look at where we have a clear interest, clear national interest, and place them. We also need to be supporting our military that we've not done the last many years, and we've allowed it to degrade in the last decade.
Yes.
Yeah, I think if we look at history, we now have, next year we'll have a $305 billion Pentagon spending. That's 90% of the Cold War peak. This nation has now been militarized for 60 consecutive years. If we're going to get weaned off this, how do we do it? What we do is realize that if you want peace, you work for justice. All the faith traditions teach you that. All these countries that are at war have enormous disparities in income and wealth, like we have here. I propose what we do as a prosperity corps, as a supplement to the Peace Corps. We know how to create prosperity, economically sound, widespread prosperity. We know how to do that. We ought to be out there doing that, not just defending our interests, but going in and helping those people who have an interest in having some of these governments who kept them poor for so long have some way to share in the prosperity that we know how to create. I don't think we're showing the statesmanship. I don't think we're showing the leadership. Instead, we're going into this defensive mode and kind of closing our borders. We have 3 billion people worldwide now living on less than $2 a day. If we don't address this, in 30 years, we'll have 5 billion people living on less than $2 a day. 3.7 billion of them will be anemic. So how do we become good Americans? We go out and help others. That's what we do, and there's a way to do it.
Mr. Ballinger, did you have a comment on this issue?
Yes. Everybody says, we put troops in the field when our national interest is concerned. My question are, what are our national interests in the Middle East? Primarily oil. We are a totally oil-dependent nation of people. What should be done is, first, we must get off foreign fossil fuels. We should build giant distilleries that perhaps create an agency like NASA and convert all gasoline engines or diesel engines to ethanol burning engines or electric engines with ethanol. The Japanese can do it, we can do it. And then analyze our interest in the Middle East the same way we might in Sierra Leone or an African country.
Let's move to the next question now from Karen Greer.
This question is for Senator Mattingly and Jeff Gates. You've mentioned need to find out why people are so dependent on Social Security. Point in fact, my father worked 20 years in the banking industry, another 20 years for state government. He died 3 years ago. And my mother retired from the school system after some 20 years of working in the school system. She decided to take her pension early. She retired early at 50-something. Because she's taking her pension, she is not eligible for my father's Social Security. Is that okay? What happens to the money that so many people put into Social Security year after year after year? Where does it go? I'm an only child. I'm paying into it too. And you're wondering, why are people living on Social Security today?
Well, I mean, Social Security is the largest tax that most people now pay. It's the largest tax for 90% of Generation X. And it's guaranteed to grow. Imagine 76 million baby boomers our age or thereabouts, barreling toward retirement, expected to live on $783 a month. And that's if you want to be a real conservative, we're the genuine conservatives to allow that to happen. So what we're pretending is that people can save their way to sufficient capital accumulation to live 25 years in retirement. That hasn't worked for the last 200 years, and now we've opened up our borders to foreign trade where people are trying to save while competing against people making 14 cents an hour. So I'm telling you, the system is so dramatically out of whack, it makes no sense at all. So what you need to do is rewire the system. And you say, well, every time I was Finance Committee counsel for 7 years. I worked in the Senate for 7 years. You can write the rules so that the system makes capitalist while it's financing capital. We just haven't done that. We haven't chosen to do that. But the rules can be changed where you do that. Every government contract that goes out of Washington we can ask who, in fact, is going to be empowered by that. So we need to get smarter about how we make people more economically self-sufficient. That's how we get out from under this.
Senator Mattingly?
Well, I think that what you're talking about is some rule now that is not involved in Social Security to be applicable. And I doubt that's going to happen, to be honest with you. I think what has to be done now with the surplus is to make certain that we retain the benefits for those that are on Social Security and those that are near retirement on Social Security. But we now must look to make certain that young people, my daughters and son-in-laws and my grandchildren, are allowed to take some of that Social Security money that they would pay and put into a private retirement account, personalized an account. Whereas they will then have, when they get to your mother's age, a good income for retirement. And that is the way we have to redirect the system to make it work for the future for the young people of our country.
John, may I step in here?
Certainly.
Yes, the problem we have right now, and Jeff pointed to it and I've discussed it a little bit, is right now if someone passes away a few years in retirement, they have no wealth they can pass on to their children. And this is a real shame. People can work their entire lives and maybe they die in their late 60s, and yet they have very little to show for it to pass on to the generations. And Chile has done, in a few years, allowed them by privatizing the system while respecting their seniors and soon to receive Social Security to be able to develop a large nest egg. Many times we have here in the U.S. that they actually have something they can pass on. So if it's unfortunate if someone dies early into their retirement, they could pass it on to their children. They have real wealth that's in their hands, and they're right now retiring many times to the benefit we are. We're in a serious situation here, as Jeff has pointed out, with both the baby boomer generation retiring soon and the next generation maybe never seeing $1 Social Security, because after all, it is a transfer payment. And that's what scares our seniors so much, and why it's not fair for the politicians to deal with it like this, is they can impose fear in the individuals receiving it because they are at the very grip of politicians because they can pull that away. And so it's important we let them have their own money as they go forward in retirement.
Yes, Mr. Wood.
Whatever all the debate is about here, which is very complicated, of course, we need to keep Social Security. There are too many people who need Social Security, and if we're going to look out for the world, we certainly first need to look out for ourselves and our parents, our fathers, our grandparents, and we need to have a substantially safe program, so hopefully we too will get a little bit of that money down the road.
Susan Hoffman, do you have a question?
Yes, this is going to go to Senator Miller. Senator Miller, this week you voted in favor of a bill regarding forced prostitution, which would punish people who bring people to the United States, immigrants to the United States, to put them in sweatshops. Yet, when you had the opportunity to vote on an amendment to the Chinese trade relations legislation that would hold U.S. companies doing business in China responsible for sweatshop labor, you voted no. Can you explain your vote?
Yes, I think I can, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to do so. The bill that the last vote that you were talking about was an amendment that was offered by Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. And it was an amendment that was offered for the purpose of killing the legislation that was before the Senate, which was for permanent normal trade relations with China. If it had been amended, it would have gone back to the House, and that would have been the end of it. And we would not have had that important piece of legislation that's so important to Georgia farmers and many others. And so what I was voting was to keep that bill amendment-free. Even though the amendment sounded good, I wanted to make sure that it did not get killed by having an amendment on it.
Can you tell me if it wasn't the case, if it wasn't going to kill the piece of legislation, would you be in favor of holding U.S. companies?
Yes, of course I would. In fact, I wrote the President of the United States a letter not long after that in which I stated that to him and asked him to please do everything he could as President and as the spokesman of the United States and our State Department to work on that and see that that did not happen.
Tom?
Let's try another pair here, Ms. Walsh and Senator Miller. Agriculture Commissioner Tommy Irvin recently led a delegation of Georgia poultry producers to Cuba, and many of them returned to say that they thought reopening trade ties with that nation could revive the poultry industry in the state. Is it time to consider ending the trade embargo with Cuba?
You want me to go first? Go ahead, Wynn.
I believe that I'm in favor of opening trade relations with Cuba, and I think it would benefit the agricultural community in Georgia. I remember back at the World Trade, there was a World Free Trade back in 1994, and I believe the manufacturing increased, the output for manufacturing in this country increased 42%, and I believe that there'll be a market for agricultural products for the farmers. The poultry too. I believe there's a great poultry industry in the state of Georgia as well, and they will have a place for their product to trade.
I happen to believe that you should never use food as a sanction against any country. There are better diplomatic tools than using food. And so, of course, I am for lifting the food sanctions to Cuba. Georgia farmers shouldn't have to bear the brunt of that.
Karen?
And it would open up new markets.
Excuse me, Karen.
Let's go back to Mr. Gates and talk a little bit about, you've mentioned numerous times in your capitalism. Let's talk about your plans, what you would like to do if elected to Senate, to change what we're looking at right now here in Georgia, change some of the ways that business is done. Anything in particular?
Yeah, I mean, this is a federal seat, so we're talking about national legislation. Correct. I mean, clearly, if we can afford Medicare, we can afford Medikid to cover 11 million uninsured children. Clearly, if you're going to have drug coverage, which I think we should have, you should not be indifferent that the Walton family has 2,428, whatever it is, pharmacies, and they already have $80 billion, so why we should further enrich them. I would rather see us prefer local drugstores and local ownership. I'd rather see us rebuild communities so that the economies are local rather than deferring to Wall Street and deferring to global capital markets. That is why democracy is at such risk. We now have 17,000 billion, that's a very large number, $17,000 billion in the hands of money managers. and it's managed on the basis of one thing only, on the basis of financial values. Unless it shows up as a financial value, it doesn't have any value. And that worries me enormously. So I think we need to take our economies back and localize them, communityize them, human-size them, and so that they become more responsible to people who live in those communities.
When I say things here in Georgia, let me get back to particularly Peach State, Peach Care for Kids, the program, problems, money that was lost federally because of what we were doing here in the state and perhaps what some other states were doing as well. What can we do to make sure that there is money for that program, money for those programs to help kids who don't have insurance?
Yeah, as I understand it, that was written as sort of a use it or lose it kind of a appropriation, and that may have been a mistake to do that, particularly when you're trying to ramp up something as administratively difficult as starting up a kids program. So I would hope that whoever is elected would get that allocation back and that appropriation back in place, and we'd learn from other states who are doing it and do it better here.
Let's take another question from Susan Hoffman.
This is going to go to Senator Mattingly. You oppose abortion. You're on the record as opposing abortion. You've said you oppose abortion. If elected, would you try to make any restrictions to the RU-486 birth control pill?
First, you're correct about my position. In respect to RU-486, of course, that was done by an agency. And, you know, if it would happen to come up in the United States Senate once again, which I doubt if it would, but if it would come up as a piece of legislation to overturn it, I would vote to overturn it. But I think the bigger question is the number of abortions in the United States. I think what we need to be focusing on is making certain that we do as much as possible to ramp down and reduce the number of abortions that we have in our country.
You said that, let me ask this again. Would you there is a chance that legislation could be passed that would limit its use. And I'm questioning, you've already said that you would overturn it. Would you want to limit its use, i.e. make it only for incest or rape, if that came up?
No, I think first it is something put out by the FDA, an approval of a pill to allow abortion. And I'm opposed to abortion.
So you would vote to overturn it, and you would vote to put limits on it if that bill came up?
Well, it would be to overturn it. If the vote came up, it wouldn't be both. It wouldn't be an option.
Well, there is a discussion of legislation that would limit it.
You'd have to see what the legislation was. It was vote to overturn it, I would overturn it. It was a vote to limit it, I would limit it. But I'm certain, having been in the United States Senate, I can assure you somebody would put up an amendment to overturn it because they keep on amending, don't they, Senator?
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question of Senator Miller. When you were first elected governor, your first term as governor, you attempted to change the Georgia flag. You called it a divisive symbol. You were unsuccessful in that effort, but should you be elected to the U.S. Senate, will you use the power and influence of your office to encourage the legislature to change the Georgia flag?
As governor of Georgia, I learned the hard way, John, that every day you spend fighting over the flag is one day you don't spend fighting for Georgia families. And the people spoke through our elected representatives, and I heard them on that issue. And I'm going to spend my time in the United States Senate working to make sure that we have a guaranteed prescription drug benefit for all of our seniors under Medicare. I'm going to be working to make sure that we shore up Social Security and that it's there for our children and our grandchildren. I'm going to be working very hard to make sure that we have a strong military and that our servicemen and women have a good quality of life. Those are the things I'm going to be fighting for, and I'm going to let somebody else fight over the Georgia flag.
What about you, Senator Mattingly? Should you be elected, would you use the power of your office to influence a change with the Georgia flag?
No, that right belongs to the state and not to the federal government. In the state of Georgia, that will be the decision. It should be put to a referendum in the state of Georgia and let the people decide. Senator Miller tried to get the flag to be taken down when he was governor. It didn't work out. I think they've learned the lesson there that it needs to be decided by the people of Georgia, and the federal government has absolutely nothing to do with it. The last thing you want is the federal government messing in the states any more than they do currently.
Right. I wasn't implying it was federal legislation, but I was referring to the influence. Now, we have a brief amount of time left. I'm going to ask the panel, yes or no. Would you use your influence if elected to the U.S. Senate to change the Georgia flag? Mr. Wood.
I agree. It should be a referendum statewide.
All right. Ms. Walsh.
Flags elicit a great deal of emotion, and both sides of Southerners. I'm not from the South, but I would believe just, I had an inquiry.
Need a yes or no, because we're running out of time.
No, I wouldn't.
You would not.
No. Leave it to the state.
All right, Mr. Ballinger.
Oh, I agree. It's a matter that should be determined by the voters.
Mr. Gates.
No, it's just a states' rights issue.
All right. And Mr. McGregor.
I'm amazed at the amount of emails I've received on this one issue, and I think it's very important. I agree with Mac. I would take this to a referendum for the voters of Georgia.
Well, thank you very much. And that concludes our question and answer session of this debate. These are the candidates on the ballot seeking to represent Georgia in the United States Senate. Your participation in tonight's debate has been a service to the people of Georgia. We thank you all for being here. I also want to thank my colleagues in the press for their participation, and we hope this program has left you better informed about the candidates, the issues, their stand on these issues, and has helped make your decision for Tuesday, November 7th. If you want more information about the election, please visit the Atlanta Press Club website. It's www.atlpressclub.org. Next Sunday night at 6 p.m., the Atlanta Press Club will present 2 more debates featuring the candidates in the 2nd Congressional District.